So, guys, today I want to review the movie Iron Claw, and I definitely want to say that it's a very, very powerful film. And do have a bunch of notes that I'm going to have with me just so I hit everything. And it's definitely one of the best films that I've seen in many, many years. And I have not gone to the movies for a very long time, and I'm definitely like a huge film buff, but I was very pleasantly surprised by this film. Like, obviously, I like professional wrestling, so definitely this movie had a bunch of hype. Usually, there's a lot of films in theaters that just don't draw my attention really, and definitely this is because of the subject matter. I really just was happy that I saw this film, and I would also say that this film definitely deserves a Best Picture nomination at least, or Best Directing, Best Picture nomination. I think it's there's talks that it's probably gonna win Best Sound Design, but I definitely think if it doesn't get a nomination for Best Picture or Best Director, it would be a travesty, and it would probably go down to Hollywood being kind of snobs and being like, okay, it's professional wrestling movie. We can't let it win awards or be nominated for what it deserves to be nominated with because it's lowbrow for the Academy Awards. And the Oscars, unfortunately, is unlike that. Is like that. And then also, too, the other thing is that Maxwell Jacob Freeman was an executive producer. So if he actually, if this film wins Best Picture, or if he gets nominated for if he gets nominated for Best Picture, what will happen is he will become the first professional wrestler in history to ever be nominated for an Oscar, um, or win an Oscar, and that could easily happen. That if it wins Best Picture, MJF would get it because if you're a producer of a movie, even if it's especially executive, you get nominated for Best Picture. So that would be really, really good. Has impeccable acting. It has really great editing, even though I felt it was a little repetitive. They also did a great job with their cinematography, and this was a very great period piece and family drama film. I think when I look at this film, it more so falls into a period piece. They really made it feel like you were back in the 1970s. And the film ends with a positive message to endure life. You know that a lot of people that sometimes people go through hard things and they solve their problems with drugs, alcohol, sex, addictions, making their life worse, or suicide. But I really think the end message of this film is that you just got to hang in there because sometimes good things happen to those who wait. Like life is not just tragedy, especially with Kevin Von Erich and his children and just what that means to him. So I do think that's the main theme. There's other themes about how of mental health versus toxic masculinity because you see Fritz von Erich coming from a generation to suck it up, or if somebody's going through a mental health crisis, it's not their problem. And Kevin has a little bit more sensitivity towards that and is a little bit more there for his brothers. And then also too that his brother, um, his his brother, um, Carrie commits suicide towards the end of the film, and definitely that was kind of like how they responded to that really came down to generations. Like obviously Fritz didn't do anything to look out for Carrie when Kevin told him to, and Kevin was like, I identify the signs really. So it definitely has that type of thing of toxic masculinity versus mental health. Like definitely older generations like Fritz kind of have the idea of, oh, well, it's your problem, or I'm not getting involved, or that's weakness. And Kevin and his children have the mentality of just hearing what other people are saying and then reacting off of it. Like if somebody says they're really depressed or they just don't know they want to survive another day, they just know how to kind of react and be like, okay, well, I got to convince them that suicide's not the answer. Um, then it kind of goes back to um, other things too, like analyzing how you're hurting on the inside, physically and mentally, versus caring about success. And there's a lot of different themes. You kind of see, um, you see like David Von Erich, who has health issues in this movie, and he kind of ignores it, and that leads to his death. Or you kind of see Ric Flair in this film, and we know the story about Ric Flair, that he was, I believe he was kidnapped as a child and put in an orphanage, and then he never got to know his real parents, and then also too he went through a lot of just physical hurt and personal demons and feeling lonely. So you kind of see him in this film where he only cares about drugs, alcohol, and sex, and living up to the Ric Flair character instead of who he was before he became Ric Flair, really. So sometimes people, like, like with professional wrestlers, they kind of live that superstar lifestyle instead of battling their own problems, or they kind of like, what the title means, everything. So I'm going to actually care more about that than how I'm hurting on the inside, and that's definitely themes. Then I've kind of talked about the old values of toxic masculinity versus the new values of looking at mental illness as a serious thing. Like I've said, great editing, great cinematography, score and sound design was done very well. I felt the editing was a little repetitive because you usually rely on a lot of L cuts and J cuts, and that's kind of when you hear bits of the audio from a future scene into an earlier scene. Like a great example is like in Taxi Driver. There's some scenes where Robert De Niro is talking to the camera, then you hear gunshots, and then it cuts to him actually firing a gun. That's kind of like that's either like an L cut or a J cut, and they use a bunch of cross dissolves. And what I kind of like is that usually after a tragedy happens, they kind of cut to the ring, so it kind of creates that metaphor of no matter what happens, the ring and the professional wrestling and the show actually is the most important thing, you know. So it's just like that's kind of like everybody's mentality is that being an entertainer is the most important thing. And then also it kind of goes down to what Vince McMahon said after the Owen Hart tragedy is the show must go on, really. So it kind of talks really about like that idea of how people sacrifice for success, really, and that could be very, very dangerous. Um, I did feel like towards the end of the film, it was a really great movie for 2 hours and 10 minutes. It went on very, very. It felt, at one point I felt like, okay, speed it up. I want this movie to wrap up. It felt a little too long, and I also kind of like two things about. There's one thing I hated and one thing that I did like about this film. I hated that they didn't have Chris Von Erich because I figured that you kind of needed to have him because he was part of the family, really. Like, they kind of omitted him. And I think they said they wanted MJF to play him. But if you're going to have a character, if you're going to feature a family and how you should have all the characters, you shouldn't admit one, even if it would have been an extra like 20-30 minutes. And I also like how they had Fritz Von Erich's character. Like, I know like there's one scene I had to walk out and take a piss, but it seemed like he was a very hard father, but I also kind of liked it because he was kind of hard and he was also emotionally abusive. And one of the reasons why I'm okay with that is because a lot of times in movies you see the father being abusive or being like Fletcher from Whiplash. So it's good to kind of show like maybe a male figure that doesn't like beat kids with belts or whatever, because that's kind of like a male stereotype of if there's a man that wants their children to be successful, and they're either a baby boomer or they're from the greatest generation, their mentality is just to beat kids with belts, really. It's good to not see that in this film because it becomes kind of like a stereotype. If it happened and they're being realistic, yes, that's good. But if it's in every single film, then it just creates that idea of all men are child beaters, or all men from the baby boomer generation are just like granddad from the Boondocks. Like they believe in whipping that belt. That was not every family. So I like how they break that. So I want to talk a little bit about the film. So it starts with a flashback of Fritz Von Erich using the Iron Claw in a match. And the opening of the movie is black and white. It's very reminiscent of Raging Bull, which is a movie about sports and its pressures influencing personal life. And the reason why Iron Claw emulates Raging Bull's cinematography in the beginning was just to kind of say there's a similar idea from Raging Bull and also Iron Claw, which is that that it's not just a show business. I mean, it's not just the entertainment of being a sports person. Like definitely boxing is a real sport. Professional wrestling is a fake sport. Choreographed. It's theater. So definitely, what I would kind of say is that even in both situations, it's kind of like that idea of it's not just what happens in the ring; it's what happens outside the ring is important as well. And also, like wrestling and sports, the expectations, it has a huge impact on every part of your life because you have to live up to the expectations of an entertainer, your dreams, and things like that. So definitely that's very very important. But also in the film, what happens is Fritz buys like a new car, and he has the mentality of hard work, but also being mad because he never got the NWA heavyweight title. Fritz has big dreams, and it also shows his desire to gamble on success, such as being a promoter or investing in the future of his children. So I think like the opening scene kind of does a really great foreshadowing of the themes of the rest of the film about who Fritz is, his goals for his son, but also kind of saying that if you look at the opening scene, you kind of see the direction that the movie's going to go, and it's a little bit like Raging Bull in the sense that it's not just what happens inside the ring. That's where all the drama and the feelings are. It's actually outside the ring, which has a bigger impact. How does wrestling affect this family? And now for my review, I'm going to go through all the characters, and I think that's the best way to do it instead of just going through the movie chronologically. I think that makes more sense. So I'm going to talk about each person. So there's David Von Erich, and he regularly wrestled with Kevin Von Erich. And in the early part of the movie, you kind of saw this as kind of like a sports film, all the brothers hanging out, having a great time. Kevin meets his girl, Pam, and it's like this very fun, everybody's like cool with each other. And then there are two deaths in the beginning of the film. That what happens with David Von Erich is that he gets a shot at the NWA title, and he actually dies in Japan because he has ruptured intestines. And what happens is that Kevin and Pam get married, and what happens is during their wedding, you see David just like throwing up blood and phlegm and other things like that. So he tells Kevin, "I'm not going to worry about it and just let it go and whatever. I drank too much." And Kevin just gives in to his brother's demands, and then what happens is in a hotel room in Japan, David dies of ruptured intestines, and it felt kind of like a little. How should I kind of say this? You didn't expect that to happen if you didn't know the story or the tragedy, so it kind of felt like a what the fuck type of moment, and I kind of like that because that's usually how we feel about death. If somebody gets that phone call, and it's actually a tragedy, it kind of catches us off guard, really. But it kind of comes to that theme too of what happened with David is that he didn't take care of his health, and you see like people like Chris Candido, another great example of somebody who didn't take care of his health and he passed away. So there's always like that type of not looking at your health or what's going on with you. Or a great example is Kevin Nash. Like I think he had a staph infection, and he was gonna like ignore it, but actually they found out if he didn't ignore it, he would have died of a heart attack from infection and other things like that. So it does come down to that theme of suck it up and move on, or I'm fine when you're not fine physically. And then also too, when we get introduced to Pam, Kevin Von Erich mentions that he had a younger brother named Jack, and Jack died at the age of 6. They just mentioned that he died, but they didn't mention how he died. And what happened was that Jack died because he stepped onto, I think, a trailer tongue. He got electrocuted. He fell into water, and then he died that way. But I don't think like Kevin was around when that happened. In the sense, he probably didn't see the death. He didn't see the parents' reaction or whatever. But he probably remembers the funeral or whatever. Really. So I think that. So I kind of think that this is kind of where some people say the movie's a little controversial because obviously Kevin is affected by death and other things. But obviously, seeing if he saw his younger brother be electrocuted and other things like that, that would probably be more like PTSD inducing because that's very traumatic to see something that disturbing. And And I also kind of like, and I'm going to cut away a little bit. I'm going to talk about Kevin next, but I want to talk about Pam. And I think like Pam is actually a very important character in this film, even though she's kind of like, even though it's really Kevin Von Erich and Fritz Von Erich, like they're kind of the centerpieces of this movie. But but I really just want to kind of say that, pardon me for a second. Yeah, I'm doing my laundry, you guys. I'm doing my laundry, so I gotta just check, make sure my clock. I'm doing my laundry, so I gotta check my clock, to make sure my alarm doesn't go off. But with Pam, she was Kevin's girlfriend, and they get married and they have kids. But she's been very supportive of Kevin. Like she kind of understands that he's hurting on the inside, and also too, like there's scenes where he's like laying in bed and all depressed, and she actually kind of just like lets him just lay and just process his feelings. And if he needs to step away from the family, she lets him do it. So I like how she's kind of very supportive of his mental health, and maybe one of the reasons why he chose to stay alive for such a long time was because she was so understanding of his hurt and his pain and all that. And that's definitely a very, very powerful thing, and then also too, they have children, and their children are kind of like, wanting to understand, want their father to understand, like it's okay to cry, it's okay to feel what you need to feel, really. And I think sometimes that's good, because you look at films like The Deer Hunter, and you see what happens with Christopher Walken's character, where he learns to not process his feelings, and then he commits suicide in that film. Or Full Metal Jacket, where Gomer Pyle learns to hold in his feelings, and then he just does a murder suicide. So when you look at Pam's character, I think she kind of really saved Kevin Von Erich's life by being that person that was loving and caring and supportive. So I want to get to Kevin Von Erich. Like, this is really Kevin Von Erich's film. He was kind of like the main character, and the second main character is Fritz Von Erich. And with Kevin, he wrestled Ric Flair, but for the NWA title, but he was disqualified for using the Iron Claw technique on Ric Flair because he kind of had it on his head, and it caused Ric Flair to bleed really badly. And at the end of the film, he almost kills his dad because Kerry commits suicide, and his dad was like, it's your problem, it's your issue, and then he wasn't around to save Kerry's life, really. So both of them weren't around, but Kevin felt like that his father Fritz could have done a little bit more, So it's very, very important. And I also feel that his mentality from his father was being taught that, you're a strong person, you've been through so much practice, so much sports, you've endured so much, you've been through a lot of different things, so therefore you can endure anything. And I think that's really almost a good mentality, that being alive, being a human being, means that we go through tragedy, we go through hurt, we go through a lot of tough situations. So sometimes when the really bad things happen, we just have to soldier. We have to kind of still stay alive. Not like, but I think he learns you need to feel what you need to feel. Talk to a therapist, cry if you need to, talk to family, get support, understand if you have another person in your life that's hurting or whatever, you can do a huge impact. You can do a lot to change their life, instead of just saying, whatever happens to you, or it's your own problem, or, I'm not getting involved because, real men don't cry or whatever, or real men don't feel anything. So, so that's definitely the case, really. So I do think that he has the strongest, definitely he is the protagonist of the film, because he learns to go from, being strong through enduring and sucking up, to being strong through enduring and feeling what you need to feel. So he's definitely the strongest character in this film, but also you kind of see what he did to Ric Flair, and that was kind of like maybe a sense that he was going into a pattern of self-destruction, anger, and frustration. So it it kind of it kind of shows that you can't just live a life and just harboring all your feelings. There will be a day where the explosion happens, so you gotta just process your feelings appropriately. It's not just enduring, as they say in King of the Hill. It's not anger. You shouldn't learn anger avoidance. You should learn anger management. You should not learn feelings avoidance. You should learn feelings management. A lot of men are taught feelings avoidance. Ric Flair also had a role in this film. Ric Flair, um, I felt like, like the person who played the Ric Flair character, like I honestly missed that Ric Flair voice. He didn't really have it. He had the persona. He also showed Ric Flair as the actor who played Ric Flair. He showed Ric Flair as somebody who's larger than life, a frat boy, but also somebody who's very intimidating because Ric Flair was very intense, and that came from his lifestyle of drugs, alcohol, sex, but also just, having to be in that big role. So definitely he was a very intense person to work with, and also to see somebody so energetic. And I also kind of felt in this film too that, one thing they didn't do with Ric Flair is that they didn't like do a little bit more of him. Like the story behind Ric Flair is I believe he was kidnapped as a kid and then he was put up into adoption. And then also too, like, he had like obviously he lost his son, I think Reed Flair, and he went through a lot of just like rough times with his life, and he also kind of felt very lonely because obviously it was, what he was. People know Ric Flair, but not the actual person behind that, so he kind of adapted that person. So I think like Ric Flair was another example of somebody who was successful despite having problems and then just doing and just embracing vices, so some people embrace their vices and they can still be successful and can go far in life, and there's some people who like the Von Erichs who embrace vices, like some have drug issues and alcohol issues and depression issues, and they suffice to that. So I definitely think that that's also a theme too, that not everybody has a bad ending when they embrace their vices to cope with their problems, even though it's better to cope with your problems instead of embrace vices. The next person I want to talk to is Kerry Von Erich. He becomes the NWA champion for 18 days. What happens is that, after David dies, Fritz does a coin toss between Kevin and Kerry, and then Kerry gets the title and then becomes the NWA champion. He lost his leg during a motorcycle accident, and he was champion for 18 days, so that was like one of the shortest reigns. And then what happens is that towards the end of the film, what happens to him is that he actually gets signed by WWF, becomes the Intercontinental Champion. He has painkillers and a drug problem. You kind of see that little foreshadow because when he comes home from Christmas, he wants his dad to fire the gun because that's what you do when you get a new gun or whatever. And he kind of has like a short temper and whatever, and that also happens when you abuse drugs like cocaine and other things like that. You become short tempered, but he commits suicide by a gunshot wound, and Kevin and Fritz find his body really. So it's definitely just really sad and painful, but also that he was working through the pain. And there was also a scene where he was like wanting to wrestle. Kerry was trying to wrestle David, and then Kerry was just being an asshole, slapping his brother, and be like, out of frustration, then Kevin pushes him to the ground, and then he's like, get back up and everything like that, really. So he's trying to like say like, you need to slow down, you need to acknowledge that you are injured. Maybe just working through it isn't the thing you need to do, really. But Kerry doesn't live up to expectations, so it just it hurts him a lot. And there's I want to cut to three more people. There's Mike Von Erich. He was a musician and he enjoyed Rush. They played Tom Sawyer through the movie, and he was told to stop his music career to become a wrestler. He used to be a tag team wrestler. I believe they won the 6-man tag team title. And then what happened is that during a match he got injured. He developed toxic shock syndrome, and then he also had slurred speech. And it kind of almost was like maybe during the surgery something happened where he had a brain. I'm not sure how toxic shock syndrome worked, but he definitely had very slurred speech, and he kind of came off as maybe mentally slow or something like happened. But he also died from a fatal dosage of tranquilizer. Maybe it was suicide. Maybe he just overdosed on drugs. But maybe that was also what happened. What they were trying to communicate was that maybe he was on tranquilizers, because obviously you come off as slurred if you take tranquilizers. But that could have been communicated better. But it was definitely also tragic that his family didn't really embrace him, or his dad said, "You're not really my favorite, or you're not one of my favorites, or you need to step up to the family plate," because Mike was more into music versus versus actually wrestling. And then his dad was actually a musician, but he gave that up to be a wrestler. And I think that his father didn't believe that music was going to really go anywhere. And what happened in the 1980s was the music video boom and all that. Or even if you looked at Mike Von Erich, what would happen if he brought music into professional wrestling? Because during that time, um, I think in the early 80s, they didn't really have music for wrestlers. And I think that almost started maybe in WWF. If I'm just all guessing. I think with Hulk Hogan and Macho Man, there was a certain point that I think I think WWF popularized music for wrestlers. But I think that early on, I'm not sure her first started. But if Mike Von Erich kind of did that and put his own songs, maybe he could have been like the Jim Johnston of the 1980s. Like Jim Johnson did the music for like Stone Cold, a lot of famous wrestlers, and the Undertaker, but maybe Mike Von Erich could have gone down that path. So it's also kind of a little unfortunate because he was kind of told to kind of like embrace wrestling, and then that led to his downfall. And there was Chris Von Erich. He's not featured in the film, but he had asthma and brittle bones. He feuded with Stone Cold Steve Austin, but he committed suicide because he felt like very insecure about himself. He's not featured in the film, but they could have each. But I said too, they should feature everybody. They shouldn't do something like, oh well, it's too sad or it's gonna be too long. If you're gonna feature a family, feature a family. And there was also a story that MJF was gonna play his role, but it's kind of fortunate that they didn't have that. And then the last part is Fritz Von Erich, and definitely he was the patriarch of the family. He had high expectations for his kids. I like that he wasn't physically abusive because, like I said, that's overdone in a lot of movies. To have the man be the ass beater, and then also too, like he kind of like was maybe the antagonist of the film because he kind of was like teaching his kids the toxic masculinity, but that came from a generation of focus on your success, focus on the hard work you need to do to get to your success. But if you're hurting psychologically, don't worry about it. And then that kind of is how like David died because you're taught to work through the pain, but you gotta like say I have an injury, I have an injury, and I also felt like he was very well acted. Like I would say that the actor who played Kevin Von Erich was well acted. Fritz Von Erich was well acted. Pam did a really great job. And overall, they did a really good job. I think like the person who played Ric Flair, he kind of was the weakest actor in the whole film, just because like again like he didn't. He almost felt like a cosplay of Ric Flair, not actually doing Ric Flair. But obviously, Ric Flair didn't get that much time. He was not like a major part of this film, so that's that really. But definitely, like it goes down to all the themes that I've kind of said. That it really that when we're going through hard times, physically and mentally, the old school mentality, suck it up and move on or work through the pain, is not always good. You have to acknowledge yourself as you're going through a hard time, really, both psychologically and physically. And there's help for that. And it doesn't mean that you're weak. It's just saying, you know what, we're all human. Like as someone once said, human beings are just like cars. If you just run a car, even though there's problems in it, eventually it's going to crash. But it's definitely a very powerful film, very cerebral, very emotional, and I wish it success with the Academy Awards. It's a highly recommend film. And for 2 hours and 10 minutes, I think they did a great job. Like I think like Robert Ebert said that it could have been more emotional and they could have done a lot more. But if they did that, it probably would have been like a 3-hour movie. And I don't think that would have been a good idea because it would have felt a little pretentious. If it was if the acting and everything was really improved, I think it would have been a good 3 hours, but it would have felt okay. It's a little too damn long, So for a 2-hour movie, they did a really great job, and I highly recommend this film, Iron Claw. The best film I've seen all years. Way better than Oppenheimer.